Well, it's certainly worth getting up for that Grand Prix. It's time for the Australian Grand Prix review. Yes, hello everyone, my name is BaxtyB and welcome back to BaxtyB F1, and today we are going to be talking about the Australian Grand Prix, which took place more than 24 hours ago now. I think everyone's sleep schedule is still recovering from the weekend. It's typical every year, we have to get up at sort of 6 o'clock in the morning, but you know what, I actually think it was worth it. It was a fantastic Grand Prix. We had the crazy starts, we had all the DNFs with 8 DNFs, 3 red flags, we had a potential Hulkenberg podium, we had penalties, we had everything happen. But here is the pole podium card, and a pretty normal looking podium in some respects. Max Verstappen taking pole. Max actually in qualifying wasn't too great by his standards. After the first runs in Q3, he wasn't on pole and he had to produce a really good lap to get that pole position ahead of George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. But he did take the race win. Awful start. He dropped behind both Hamilton and Russell, so Russell and Hamilton even. And then was basically stuck in third behind them. Wasn't able to make much impression. But then he did eventually find his way past Lewis Hamilton. Russell pitted and then got screwed over by the first red flag, unfortunately for him. And then Fernando Alonso was in third place, chased down Hamilton for much of the race, and then he did get spun round after the third race start by Carlos Sainz, which we're going to get into. He was initially out of the points, but then they reordered everything and he went back to third and he got his 101st podium, though he did break the streak of those who get 101 podiums take race wins. In terms of my prediction, I got 2 out of 3 on the podium, just in the wrong order. I had Verstappen finishing second and I actually had Alonso winning the race. Didn't have Hamilton on the podium, but you know what, this was Lewis Hamilton's best drive of the season by a long way. Of course I did get the pole sitter correct. So let's get to the main talking point of today's race. Did the FIA get it right? And what I mean by this is, were they right to throw the red flags? They've given pretty interesting details as to why they threw certainly the first 2 red flags. The third red flag was a complete no-brainer. I'm not going to spend too much time debating that one. But the first red flag came on around lap 9. Alex Albon had a big crash, put him out of the race, and he ended up across the gravel. It's around turn 2, turn 3. Lost the rear of the car, hit the barrier quite hard, and allowed a lot of gravel and debris to be strewn across the track. There was initially a safety car period, at which point a number of the cars actually pitted, including the likes of Sergio Perez, Esteban Ocon, and most crucially George Russell from the race lead, which left he went down to 7th, and then Lewis Hamilton was leading the race ahead of Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso. But not long after that, there was a red flag thrown, and the FIA tried to justify this by saying that it was due to debris in the gravel on the track. And I kind of get this one. It's harsh on Russell because he'd been brilliant in that first stint. He'd got the lead off Max, and he was keeping Hamilton just about behind. There was some suggestion that he was asking for team orders again. Again, I'm not buying it. He was asked to push on his tyres, and he didn't. He said, I've got Lewis and Max behind me fighting. No chance am I doing that. But regardless, I think poor old Russell got screwed over by this, and it kind of raises the question of the red flag rule. Are the red flags... should you be allowed to change your car during red flag periods? I don't think you should. I think it's ridiculous that you can do this, that you can change your tyres and essentially have a free pit stop. I think the cars should be neutralised and not touched. And if you have damage, sorry, tough. You just have to hold on to that. And I know what a lot of Red Bull fans will say is, oh, well, Hamilton only won the British Grand Prix because he was able to fix his car during the red flag period. And yeah, I get that. And realistically, Lewis shouldn't have been allowed to do that. But those are the rules that we're playing with right now. I think the FIA should look into it. I really do. But they seem pretty reticent to do that. They seem happy with the red flag rules as it is. So, you know what? That they're going to keep it the way they want to do it. And I don't think that's going to change. I think this red flag was fine. I think with the fact that gravel was on the track, I do think that this red flag was fine. I think they... what's the best way to put it? I think in the interest of safety, and obviously Crofty made a really good point about this, is that we're not the marshals, we are not the clerk of the course, we can't see what's on track. And it seems to me that the FIA were happy for it to be a safety car, and then they got a call from those at the scene to say, actually, no, we need to red flag this race. As I said, it was harsh on Russell, but and the others that pitted, but I think this was the right call. Now, the next red flag happened after an accident with Kevin Magnussen around the lap 54, lap 55 part. And what happened here was that Magnussen hit the wall coming out of turn 2, and it broke his suspension, and he actually lost his tyre. And again, there were bits of debris across the track, and initially, once again, it was a safety car, only for the race to then be red flagged on lap 56. This caused huge controversy, massive controversy. You could hear the drivers exclaiming wildly as to why this red flag had been thrown. Fernando Alonso in particular was absolutely fuming. He just didn't seem to understand it. But it did present an opportunity, particularly for Lewis Hamilton, to try and win the race. Max Verstappen had got past Hamilton, was a long way down the road, a really, really long way down the road, and he had his lead cut, and it gave Hamilton a chance to potentially grab a race win. Now, was this red flag correct? Initially, I thought no, but then it came to light earlier today, or I certainly saw it earlier today, that actually a fan had been hit by some of the debris caused by the Magnussen accident, and it seemed like there was a lot of sort of metal filings on the track. And again, it seems that the stewards and the clerk of the course got to the scene of the accident and went, you need to red flag this race. Yes, it didn't seem like there should be a red flag, but we can't see it. Now, I know that there was some suggestion that they wanted the red flag for entertainment purposes. I do not believe that the FIA would ever throw a red flag purely to give us an entertaining finish. Certainly, I think Michael Masi may have done that in Baku 2021, but I don't personally feel that was the case here. Clearly, there was something wrong, and the fact that a fan did get hit and hurt by a little bit of debris, like the fan is fine, just worth pointing out. But because he was clipped by something, then clearly that actually makes the red flag necessary. So I think that's a very important thing to point out at this stage. But it did leave us with the 2-lap shootout, and unfortunately that restart went horrendously wrong. Carlos Sainz pitched Alonso into a spin. Lance Stroll he tried to do something into turn 4 and he went wide. The two Alpines took each other out. Perez was pitched across onto the gravel. Sargent took De Vries out as well. I mean, it was an absolutely horrendous race start, as it were, and a lot of drivers came off worse. And this is where I think the FIA may have messed up a little bit, because we had a jumbled order. Once the red flag was thrown on lap 57, you had Verstappen leading. He actually had a really good start. His previous 2 starts have been awful, but that start was very, very good. Kept Hamilton behind. Alonso was trying to pressure Hamilton into a mistake, but Hamilton held strong. But then behind him, Alonso was then hit by Sainz, as I said. Sainz was able to hold 3rd place, and Nico Hülkenberg in the Haas had found his way up to 4th. It was a fantastic effort by Nico Hülkenberg. Yuki Tsunoda had kind of picked his way through the field to get himself into 5th, whilst all the carnage around him was going on. Then you had Norris and Piastri and Zhou and Bottas all in the points as well, and I think Perez was the one propping up the points in 10th. But it was absolute craziness, and the FIA basically then decided that they were going to reorder everything back to where it was, and they felt that the best way to do that was from the grid start on lap 57. So it meant that Alonso was promoted back to 3rd because he wasn't forced into a retirement. It meant Stroll was put back into the points as well, because both the Astons were out with the points. Zhou Guanyu was able to stay in the points. Bottas was put out of the points. Yuki Tsunoda was initially put out of the points until the penalty for Carlos Sainz was applied, and then he was able to get AlphaTauri's first point of the season. And I don't feel that they did this the right way. I think it was clear, and Haas actually protested this, because with the penalty for Sainz, it was possible that they could have had maybe a podium at this stage, and we were not entirely sure. But they said there was a order after the timing screens, and you could have just left it at that, because you could clearly tell what the order was when the red flag was thrown. And the FIA basically admitted that that could be true, but they were satisfied with what race director Niels Vicic did. And to be honest with you, I think, whilst I think it is an unsatisfactory solution, I think it was the only solution available to the FIA. I don't see what more they could have done. It was a very difficult situation. This wasn't like Silverstone last year, where they could just go, right, we've had a disastrous race start, let's just restart everything and just put everything back to where it was, because that was lap 1. This was lap 57 of a 58 lap race, and then the race finished under safety car, which, you know, you never want to see, but obviously it needs to be done in the interest of safety. I don't see why they could have just completely reset and gone back to lap 57, but because lap 57 had been completed, apparently that wouldn't have been possible, but I think it may have been. I don't know. I'm sure wiser heads will be able to point it out. But I think, on the whole, I think the FIA, in terms of the red flags and the reordering, did get things right for them. I think so. I think they were left in an impossible situation. There were other solutions available to them, but I think the FIA did what they normally do, and they backed their decision once the decision had been made. And I think, whilst that's annoying for Haas, I think there was not a lot they could do in that situation. Now, we need to talk. We absolutely need to talk about Carlos Sainz and his penalty. And we're going to do a bit of rudimentary sky padding here. So let's have a look at that image now. Okay, so I've got paint here. I'm going to try and draw some lines here. So this was moments before the crash at the restart. And we can see Carlos Sainz here, and he's basically about to plough into Alonso and take him out and send him pitching off into a spin. Now, here's where things get difficult for Carlos Sainz, because there were two other incidents, one of which is about to happen here between De Vries and Sargent, and basically Sargent locks up and takes De Vries out the race, and they both end up here in the gravel trap. And then obviously Gasly, who's been pitched off here, is leaving the track, and as he's trying to get his speed back up, basically ends up colliding with Ocon, who currently is here fighting Yuki Tsunoda and Lando Norris. So yeah, those two are about to collide, and there were no penalties for those. And I think personally, Sargent and Gasly were lucky for this, but Carlos Sainz was penalised. So here's the thing. Gasly and Sainz were side by side coming here about before they hit the apex of the corner. Now Gasly outbrakes himself and essentially forces himself and Perez wide, and that's why Perez ended up back down in 10th at the red flag. But the stewards felt that basically Sainz was at full fault for the crash with Alonso. Now, at the time, I thought this was a ridiculous decision. I mean, Carlos was on the verge of tears at the end of the race. It was absolutely heartbreaking to listen to. But looking at this image, I feel like the stewards maybe felt that Carlos could get down here and could have given Alonso a bit more room, who was behind Hamilton. He would have had to have gone wide, so maybe more in this angle here, to go wide round turn 2 and 3. Rather than just ploughing straight into the side of Alonso and sending him spinning off. Now, there is some mitigation here that I feel that the FIA perhaps didn't quite bring into it. They did bring this mitigation in for the Gasly incident and for the Sargent incident. And the mitigation being that it was essentially a race start, which I feel could have been applied here, particularly for the fact that the race was then reordered and Alonso didn't lose his place. But the other mitigation is to do with the tyres. We saw in qualifying that the drivers were having to do quite a lot of warm-up laps for this race, for qualifying. Even though doing warm-up laps to get heat into their tyres so they could best utilise those tyres. And they had been trying desperately. All of them have got the soft tyre on. And you could see the likes of Verstappen and Hamilton and all of them just weaving behind the safety car when they're heading back to the spot. Ultimately, I don't think the cars had a lot of heat in the tyres because they'd missed so much running on Friday in practice 2 with the rain. They weren't able to accurately predict what they needed to do with the tyres. And I think Carlos had slightly colder tyres, has outbraked himself, gone into Alonso, and I think if he had more grip and more heat in his tyres, he probably would have been able to get out of it and take this line here. I'll do another arrow. Take this line here to kind of avoid that contact with Alonso, and therefore both drivers can go off on their way. I think the penalty still is harsh, but I can understand why they have awarded that penalty to Carlos. But I think because it was reordered, because the race was reordered and Alonso got his place back, I think that the penalty was harsh. They probably could have given him a reprimand for careless driving, but he was given a penalty and 2 penalty points on his licence as well, which they hang around for a year. Which is why I think Gasly was very lucky to get away with something, because he would likely have got a race ban because he's got too many points on his licence. But yeah, I think it's a harsh penalty. It is probably fair because he should have been more aware of Alonso here and taken that evasive action. But he was so busy trying to fight Gasly, and of course, as we know, Gasly forces him and Perez off, and that ultimately is what led to the big pile-up. And you know, it was a shame, but I do think that Carlos was at fault. But I think they should have mitigated for the fact that it was a race start, and they should have spoken to Carlos after the race. It should have been investigated after the race and gone, look, what happened? And he would have just said, look, I was fighting Gasly. Yeah, we got to here. He outbroke. I then turned in, and I had cold tyres, so I couldn't quite take the evasive action to avoid Fernando. And as I said, Fernando also said that this penalty was harsh. He said he did feel it was harsh and he felt sorry for Sainz. And of course, because of the fact that they ended under the safety car and it was a 5-second penalty, Sainz lost all his points. He was due to get 12 points and he didn't get them. And I think that is too harsh a penalty for an incident like this. I feel that it should have just been a reprimand on this incident and basically seen as a racing incident with more fault being placed on Carlos Sainz. But I can fully understand why the FIA have given the penalty. Well, yeah, okay. Well, we need to move on and let's get back to talking points. So the next talking point in this race is the improvement shown by Mercedes, which caught everybody off guard. They finished 2-3 in qualifying with Russell ahead of Hamilton. And then obviously Lewis was able to get a podium. George did unfortunately DNF. He had an engine failure, which was really harsh, because after the restart, George showed some really good pace. He got himself back up to 4th. He was chasing Alonso down for that final podium spot, but alas, his engine went nope, not having that, and he had to retire from the race. It's the first mechanical failure for a Mercedes for a long time. I honestly cannot remember the last time that they just had a straight up mechanical failure that wasn't caused by an accident. Obviously, Lewis had a couple of DNFs last year, as did George as well, based on accidents, but they didn't have mechanical issues, so this was the first time it's happened in a while. But the pace for the car looked good, and I'm excited to see where Mercedes go from here. I know there was some circumstances working for them. In qualifying, the temperatures were slightly cooler, and I think that allowed them to get their tyres working a bit better. But as I said, in the race, they looked good as well. I mean, Alonso and Hamilton had a great little battle. That's probably a slight spoiler for fight of the day, but this was a really interesting weekend for Mercedes. I think they're in a good place. Obviously, George's retirement cost them some points in the constructors, so they are still in third place behind Aston Martin. Obviously they would have benefited hugely had the race not been reordered. But yeah, happy times for Mercedes, good times for Mercedes, and I'm content that when we get to Baku and we start to see some of these upgrades arrive in a month's time, we might see some real improvement from the Mercedes boys. Next up, McLaren points. Oh, McLaren points, absolutely fantastic this. Yeah, first points this season for McLaren. AlphaTauri as well. Yuki Tsunoda did get points, but he was slightly benefited more from the Carlos Sainz penalty, whereas McLaren were both in the points once everything was reordered. And I think Norris and Piastri did a really good job in the race. Look, that car is not where they wanted to be. In a straight line, that car has got no pace at all. But they were both competitive. They both fought hard. They did their best, and really happy for McLaren because their first two races were absolute stinkers. But they've gone to Australia, they've gone to Melbourne where Oscar's from, and they've been able to get points. Really happy. McLaren are kind of my second team, so it has been painful to see them struggling, but hopefully these upgrades that they bring, and they are starting to hire some people as well behind the scenes, I think they're in a good spot. And it's going to take them a while, but I can see McLaren getting back to where they were, sort of that 4th, 5th place. They're 5th currently in the Constructors, but I don't see them finishing that high up once the season is all said and done. Now, there was an interesting talking point actually at that second restart with Max Verstappen. I'm going to put the image up, and you will see that Max was apparently out of his grid box. And of course, we've seen 2 penalties for drivers being out of their grid box. But if you look closely at it, Max's front tyres are on the line, and that is perfectly permitted within the rules. If he's over the line, that's a penalty, and if it hadn't been given, I would have been the first one saying, hang on a minute. But to give the media their due, they saw what was going on social media, they looked at it and they said, no, Max is absolutely fine, his tyres are on the line. Now, I know some people are saying, well, no, that should never be the case, but that they're in the rules. His tyres are on the line, he's absolutely fine. I don't think Max has done this deliberately, and this is some kind of another galaxy brain level strategy from Max. He was just trying to position his car a little bit better, that he could block off Hamilton at the start so he didn't lose the lead. He was remembering what had happened with George Russell on the actual race start. So yeah, should Verstappen have got a penalty? No, absolutely not. He didn't deserve one because of the fact that he was on the line. He was within the rules. But yeah, it once again raises questions about how much can the drivers see with these bigger front tyres and everything else. They did extend the boxes, but no. Did Verstappen deserve to get a penalty? No. Alpine disaster. Oh dear, Alpine. Not your day, unfortunately. They were doing really well. Pierre Gasly had put in an amazing drive. He was sat P5, he was P4 for a lot of that race, but did lose out to Carlos Sainz in the end. And then unfortunately, just a really unhappy set of circumstances led to both of them colliding with each other. We've had a look at the picture, and you saw that Pierre was going off at turn 1, turn 2. He rejoins the track over the gravel, and unfortunately, as he's trying, and he doesn't see who's behind him, which is why I think he personally should have had a penalty, but that's just me. And he doesn't see who's behind him, and the one person who is there and collects him is Esteban Ocon. I think of anyone who will be annoyed about that red flag for the Magnussen incident, it will be Alpine, because they lost a huge load of points. They were both running in the points, they were both looking good, but unfortunately they missed out now because of that, and it's potentially damaged parts of the car, and it could lead to penalties down the road. We'll have to see how that works for both of them. Both drivers are okay, which is obviously great to see, and also I know people would maybe thinking this could be the start of the French Civil War that has been predicted between Gasly and Ocon, but both drivers seem to accept the situation as it was. Pierre immediately apologised to Esteban. Apparently they spoke about it. They did produce a nice little PR video to kind of apologise to the fans for what happened. But look, this, for me, this was just a very unhappy accident, and Alpine were the big losers of today, or yesterday even, unfortunately, and not a lot they could do, really, not a lot they could do. Fight of the day, I've already alluded to this, was the fight between Hamilton and Alonso throughout that race. Alonso was trying to chase down Hamilton, but Hamilton masterfully kept Alonso behind and out of that 1 second DRS range. And whenever Alonso threatened to get close, Hamilton pulled out more of a gap. And Alonso was very complimentary of Lewis Hamilton after the race, particularly after the fact that he said that we're seeing what Lewis can do in a normal car, and then Lewis has made him look a bit stupid this weekend. But Alonso, I think, was very appreciative of Hamilton's drive, and once again, it's champion showing champion respect, and he could appreciate how good a drive that was, because I think a lot of drivers would have buckled under the pressure that Alonso was putting them under, but Hamilton stayed strong and kept himself in front of Alonso. It was a masterful drive, and Hamilton said over the radio, "I am not losing out to him. I am not losing out to Fernando Alonso." And that was a big psychological blow landed by Lewis, because I think Lewis and Fernando are going to be fighting a lot this year, and I cannot wait for it. We've been waiting for this proper rematch since 2007. It's going to be amazing. The pass of the day, again, I've already alluded to this, was Pierre Gasly's, defence ending against Carlos Sainz. It was Sainz going past Gasly. It was a really beautiful move, kind of dummied him a little bit, just went round the outside, and it was a lovely, lovely move from Carlos. That was the highlight of his day before the penalty, which, as we've discussed, was harsh, but probably fair. Okay, without further ado, we have to get into our driver rankings. Let's not forget, with driver rankings, my word is final, my word is law. Now, I have copped some heat for this on social media. I did release these earlier than normal. So we'll quickly go through them and see how we're getting on. Verstappen, I've given a 9. Pole, race win. The reason he gets his 9 is he wasn't too hot in qualifying by his standards. I think he probably should have been P1 after the first run in Q3. His first 2 race starts were crap, particularly the first one. The second one wasn't particularly brilliant either. He should have got past Hamilton. But then when he did get past Lewis, aided by DRS, he looked very strong. He looked very, very strong. Built that gap really quickly, and he did also have that off as well near the end of a lap, cutting the grass. So again, loses a little bit of marks for that. But it didn't cost him too much, so that's why I'm giving him a 9. Some people were suggesting I should have given him an 8, but it wasn't like that mistake happened when he had Hamilton behind him, and then Hamilton took the race win because of that. It was just a slight mistake from Max, and he lost 2 seconds. He was already 10 seconds up the road. He was then 8 seconds up the road. So it wasn't a massive deal breaker for Max on that occasion. Sergio Perez, he had a bit of a wretched weekend, didn't he? Good Friday, but on Saturday his car was all over the place. He said he had an engine problem, or engine braking problem. Red Bull seemed to suggest it was driver error. I'm more likely to believe the driver, considering he's in the car. And unfortunately, he didn't set a time in Q1, so he started from the back of the grid. Well, in fact, he started from the pit lane because he had to have some changes made to his car. But he recovered really well to finish. He was 5th in the end, but that was after the accident on lap 57. And it was a very good recovery drive. He was screwed over a little bit by the red flags. He didn't have that same serene progress that Max had, but that was partly due to the fact that I think other cars around him were quicker than they were in Saudi, but also strategy didn't come to his aid. So look, Checo's still second in the championship. He's about 15 points behind now. He's got a long way to go. He's not going to win the championship, but if he can at least make it close, that would be entertaining. But this was probably as good a damage limitation weekend as Checo could have hoped for. Charles Leclerc. Oh, Charles, you had a stinker. Only P7 in qualifying, and then he was out in turn 1. Clipped by Stroll. There was some suggestion that Verstappen going wide at turn 1 to cause that accident. I don't personally believe that. I've had a look at it. Charles just went in a bit too hot and basically was caught by Stroll. It was deemed a racing incident. I completely agree with that. And Charles has had an Australian Grand Prix weekend to forget. He really has. Winning last year, out in lap 1 this year. And I know a lot of Charles Leclerc fans, very passionate, but sometimes a little bit too overzealous with their support. Not Verstappen levels, but we're getting close. They weren't very happy about it. when you get up at 6-7 o'clock in the morning to watch a race and then your driver DNFs in one corner, not ideal, is it? Carlos Sainz, he would have had a 9 had he not got the penalty, but I'm going to have to give him an 8 because Carlos's pace was phenomenal. He was so good. He looked really, really strong this weekend. I think this was definitely his strongest weekend of the season. But unfortunately, that mistake has cost him everything in terms of points. But it was a really strong drive, pass of the day. Could have had a podium if things hadn't been reordered. Initially, and then obviously the penalty would have cost him. But it was a fantastic effort by Carlos before that incident near the end of the race, and it would have been a 9, but he gets an 8. George Russell. Now this was an interesting one. I've given Russell an 8. I have given him an 8, and I'm sticking to it. Yes, he had a really good qualifying. Yes, he had a really good start, and he was screwed over by the safety car. But it's hard for me to give him a 9 when he didn't finish the race. I think if he'd finished the race, he would have had a 9 or even a 10, depending on how he got on. But he looked good. But for me, it's an 8. Sometimes you just have to go with a gut feeling, and the gut feeling here is that I have to give Russell an 8, not a 9. But another very good weekend from George Russell, and he's certainly showing the world and Mercedes and everyone else that when Lewis Hamilton does decide to retire, they've got a ready-made number 1. They've got a ready-made world champion ready to go, and I think he once again proved his world champion credentials for me. Lewis Hamilton gets a 10. He gets a 10. Perfect weekend for Lewis, really. Yes, he was out-qualified by George, but you know what? He maximised everything that he could do. The race win was beyond him for this one. Max was just, again, too quick, but Lewis delivered, and particularly in the fact that he still wasn't comfortable with the W14, and it was a masterful display by Lewis Hamilton, and I have to give him a 10. Ocon and Gasly both get 7s. Ocon had a decent qualifying. It wasn't great. He was running around the higher end of the top 10. Probably would have ended up getting some decent points if he hadn't have been taken out in that lap 57 incident. He did okay. He showed some decent pace. As I said, he was screwed over by the red flag. Actually, of course, I forgot that. He was screwed over by the red flag. But yeah, unfortunate for Esteban. Didn't really work out for him. Pierre would have had an 8. I do hold him responsible for the accident with Ocon. So he does lose a mark for that. But it was... it was a very good weekend for Pierre, actually. And I'm disappointed for him that he didn't do better. But, unfortunately, that's motor racing. Norris and Piastri as well both get 7s. Lando looked punchy here. As I said, the McLaren is a complete tractor. It's got no straight line speed at all. But both of the drivers looked a bit more comfortable in the car. I think they both would have got 8s if they had slightly better qualifyings. Oscar was out in Q1, Lando went out in Q2. And I think they did benefit from the lap 57 melee. Certainly Oscar did. Lando would probably have still been in and around the points at that stage. But both of them scored points, and that's a good effort for the McLaren boys. Valtteri Bottas. Valtteri, just again, not a good weekend. He started from the pit lane. He didn't really feature. And he did miss out on points even after the Sainz penalty. He was P11. So Valtteri really didn't feature too highly in all of this. Zhou Guanyu, though, did score points. He was P9, got 2 points. First point of the season for him. Really good effort this from Zhou Guanyu. I think, once again, he's proved that he's worth having around. And I think, you know what? There's a lot of pressure on him, particularly with Théo Pourchaire knocking on the door. And so far, he's done what he needed to do. Really, really good effort by Zhou Guanyu. Fernando Alonso gets an 8. Was beaten by the Mercedes. Showed some decent pace in the race, and was slightly fortunate to get that podium after the reorder. The accident wasn't his fault at all. But yeah, another very strong weekend for Fernando. Stroll gets a 7. He was just slightly off the pace, wasn't he? And he was involved with that tangle with Charles Leclerc, even though, as I said, it wasn't really his fault. But he just isn't quite impressing himself upon Alonso. Alonso's kind of destroying Lance right now, and I want Lance to step up. I know he's still not 100% fit, and I think Baku a track that Lance traditionally goes very well at, is going to be the first test for him. Magnussen just a stinker of a weekend. Just didn't qualify very well. Once again beaten by Hulkenberg. Wasn't racing particularly brilliantly. Was kind of on the fringes of the top 10, and then of course he had that accident which ended his race. Weekend to forget for Kev. He will want to walk away from that. Nico Hulkenberg though. We nearly had the Hulkenberg podium. Nearly had it, but unfortunately, as I said, I think the FIA made the right call. It was a fantastic effort by Nico. He was P7 in the end, if I remember correctly, but he showed really good pace in the race. That's been his biggest downfall so far, that his race pace hasn't been particularly good, but actually he showed good pace this weekend, and hopefully this felt to me like a step forward for Hulkenberg, and he's establishing himself as the team leader in Haas. And most importantly, he has justified Günther Steiner's decision to drop Mick Schumacher and bring him in. Absolutely 100% justified it for me now at this stage. Yuki Tsunoda, P10, gets a 7. Was doing okay in the race, and then nearly did brilliantly at that second restart. But he is comfortably handing Nick De Vries's backside at the moment, and De Vries gets a 6. Just didn't really impress himself on the race at all. Out-qualified by Yuki again. If Nick wants to have more than one season in Formula 1, he needs to start bucking his ideas up, because he's not delivering on the potential that we know that he's got and that we have seen in other Formula. I know the AlphaTauri is not a good car, and the Red Bull seat is potentially there for him to take in the future, but he has to do more, because Yuki right now is kicking his arse, and we just didn't think that would be possible. Alex Albon, Alex, I feel so sorry for Alex. If he'd finished the race, he would have been an 8 or a 9 depending on where he finished. He qualified in Q3. It was an amazing effort. He was always the fastest in the middle sector as well. It's very weird. Just everyone go really quickly in sector 1 and 2, quicker than Alex, but sector 2 was his sector. It should be renamed the Albon sector. Did have that accident early on though, which did cause him to DNF, and unfortunately no luck for Alex there. Logan Sargent didn't have a good qualifying, didn't have that much pace, and then he took out De Vries at the end of the race, so quite simply, he gets a 6. And that is that for the driver rankings for the Australian Grand Prix. Well, we do have a bit of a break now before the Azerbaijan Grand Prix in Baku. This is due, of course, to the fact that China was cancelled and we're not replacing that race with anything else. So we've got about 3 to 4 weeks now before the next race, and everyone can just have a little bit of a break. I've got some video ideas that I want to do, and we are going to have to talk about the future of the channel moving forward, because I've got some things coming up in my singing career which I've got to talk to you guys about and kind of explain how things are going to work with the channel. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere, just things are going to have to change slightly. But that's for a couple of weeks down the line. But if you've enjoyed this video, and if you agree, disagree with anything that I've said, please comment below. I will try and read them as much as I can. I'm not having the best notifications on my end for when people comment, but I will try and keep an eye as best as possible. And if you want to see more of my videos, then it's very simple. Hit the subscribe button below, hit the bell notification, and also please like this video because it does wonders for the algorithm. And if you want to interact with me, I'll be probably doing the odd Twitter space here or there at some point. I might be doing one tonight, but can't be sure about that just yet. Just keep an eye on my Twitter. You can find the link to my Twitter in the description below. But guys, until next time, please stay safe, and I shall speak to you all very, very soon.